Hi all, welcome back to the Sprucegate Modeling. Today I'll be making a diorama for my 156th Tiger 2, and I'll be starting off with a wall for it. This will be a relatively urban setting, and this is from the Rubicon Models City Wall set. I assembled it and primed it gray, and I am now painting the bricks on it with an orangey color. I'm being pretty careful here. It's honestly at this point just easier to paint inside the lines. I could airbrush it, but I just didn't. I don't love the color that dried. It's a little light for my taste, so I'm darkening it a bit with some glazing and just generally thinner paints, also adding some color variation. Then I'm going to take some paint and paint individual bricks, lighter and darker colors. These are all oranges, reds, some flesh tones, various things of the sort. And this is to just give the wall a little bit of pop. You do want to make sure that these aren't overpowering though. And after weathering, it should be noticeable, but not to an extent that it's distracting from the overall continuity of the diorama. So here you can see those first two orangey colors done, and then I'm going to go in with a darker red because it's better to go both ways from the base color than just one. I found that adding a bit of variety can add a lot of realism. And here you can see that it is a bit messy. That's okay. I don't actually plan on using the base color for anything. I just figured that it might be easier to paint inside the lines for now. The brick wall also does have two sides. Try to be consistent in doing both sides, approximately the same number of each type brick. So now I'm going to paint the plaster. Here you can see that it's a creamish color, light cream. It would be white, but pure white and dioramas don't really tend to mix super well because things get dirty. I'm being very careful here not to get it on the bricks because that would be less than ideal, although you can clean it up later if worse does come to worse. I'm going to paint the iron grid on this now. This is just a super dark gray. I think you all know how to paint metal at this point. Just dark gray metallic highlight. It can be kind of tricky to figure out where this stops and ends on this particular model, but I think it'll be fine. Now I'm going to apply some weathering washes. This first one is a dark brown oil wash that I mixed up. It is going to go over all the plaster stuff pretty heavily. It doesn't look great now, but once it dries, it should look pretty decent. And I'm going to try to stop it from collecting super heavily on the flat surfaces. I'm going to have to move that around a little bit more later. Here you can see it just about done, and there it is dry. I'm then going to take a black wash, go over the bricks. I have decided not to really go for the mortar in between the bricks at this small scale. I'm not totally sure how I would achieve it, probably with a wash, but I think it would look a little bit weird. This is a pretty light black wash, all things considered. This is just to kind of bind it back together. And here you can see the wall kind of starting to take a final form, although it obviously is not done yet. I'm now going to add a rust wash, very light, to the metal bits. As metal things and the elements tend to do, this would rust, and it'll add a nice subtle effect and add a lot more variation to the bars here. I'm now going to add some grime in the form of a heavier black wash. I'm going around corners and details for this. This is more of a weathering effect, and this again will dry much lighter than it looks right now. Here you can see it fully dried, although this camera isn't great for picking up on it. Like I said, final touch on the metal is some more metallic highlights. And with that, we are done with the fence, and we're moving on to a house for the diorama. Now, this is just a piece of plastic, kind of weirdly shaped, you'll see it in a second, that I tape that I glued some popsicle sticks onto in the pattern that you see here. I then used some filler to fill the gaps. I think you can see it pretty well. Some footage disappeared, which is why I don't have film of me actually making these, but do what you can do. The top. Alright, for the walls, I'm going to be using some wall filler. And I'm going to be putting that on as evenly as I can over all of the gaps, give it some texture, give it some depth, and perhaps most importantly, some carvability. My wall filler is very thick and clumpy, so hopefully you will have an easier time doing this than I did. I needed to do a lot of sanding when I was done. But overall, it turned out pretty well. Try to get it as flat as you can with the spatula because it is worth it. Very, very worth it to get that done. The less sanding you have to do, the more fun the project will be because sanding can just take forever and the dust gets everywhere. It's just not worth it. So here you can see I also carved some bricks into this in the damaged areas and built a floor on the inside just out of popsicle sticks again. Some more disappearing footage on that one. But for Rebel on the inside, I'm going to be taking some of the bigger clumps and putting them to good use to create irregularly shaped mounds. Here you can see that I'm covering quite a bit of the floor, go less under the second floor that I built there because it is not realistic that debris would fall straight through the floor. Here you can see just about the end product, although I do need to cut the edges off because it is very messy. And I'll likely need to do so again before the diorama is finished. This is a very, very messy process using this. If you could just do this out of foam, I would very much recommend it. Alright, I'm going to press some debris into here. Wooden board snapped off from the second floor and ceiling. Because who knows, this might have been a bomb, heavy artillery, something of the sort. But, explosives will screw up a house. So yeah, sink those in. Do this while it is still wet. That is very much worth it. Because otherwise it will look very unrealistic when you are done. I am also going to be taking some of the shingles that I made for the roof out of clay. The roof is just popsicle sticks and clay. You'll get a closer look at that in a few minutes. And I'm going to sprinkle that over as well as a bunch of sand to give it a nice screwed up texture. Alright, we're moving on to painting. Here you can see some of the carving that I did. I painted this a cream color, and then I didn't like that, so I went over with a more white-looking color. It looked way too dirty for my tastes, because dirty, I want to do that during weathering. Here is the end result. I am going to be giving it a heavy, heavy, heavy black wash to accent the details because it'll look nicer that way, and it'll be easier to paint. You can see that when the wall filler dried, it left quite a few cracks that you could, accentuate with a knife or one of the spatulas, as well as those bricks I carved in. That was a really easy detail that definitely was worth it. You just had to carve out certain areas until it was thinner there, and then take your knife and carve bricks into it. Here you can see that all dried. It gives it some nice depth, and I'm going to move on to painting those wooden beams. Made sure that you did not get any of the wall filler on those because it can be annoying to try to find them again and you can damage the effect. And be very careful painting these, of course, because it isn't worth having the overspill and needing to go back over with the base color and then the black wash. You can also see here that I'm trying to add some of the contrast with this. One of the things that this house needs to have to work will be contrast. And speaking of contrast, here's the roof. Like I said, I took some toothpicks, I cut them up, and then I took some popsicle sticks, cut them down, and covered them in those shingles that I made out of clay. Just little things that I cut out and then baked in the oven. I'm painting these dark brown, get into all the nooks and crannies here. It's very important to have a solid, good coverage, but once you have that, it should be really easy to proceed. Here you can see the wood dried, looks pretty nice, and I'm going to move on to painting the bricks. I paint these the same way that I did them on the wall, get some nice continuity within the diorama, and be very, very, very careful because you've already done some painting here and it is not worth screwing that up. I would also suggest putting it on a little bit lighter than I did. The paint is a little bit thick, as I'm sure you can see in some of the areas, because yeah, I had to go back over it with a black wash to get each individual brick accentuated, and it probably would have been easier if I hadn't needed to do that. I put a black wash over the roof as well, although I don't think it was fully necessary. It didn't do very much. On the roof, I then took some light gray and I just kind of scraped it, added some marks, just color variation, which is something that you always want in these dioramas. Alright, we're going to move on to getting a little bit of that same color variation in the wood with a lighter brown. Just lightly touch some of the areas with thin paint, and try to make it pretty consistent. You don't want any drastic transitions. Alright, time to move on to the road for this diorama. This is just a plastic sheet with bricks scribed into it that I bought, and I painted it dark gray with the airbrush, and I'm now going over with light gray. You can see that I put this on a little bit heavy there at the beginning. Try not to make the same mistake I did. I just wanted to get some color variation, and I went way too heavy. I'm going to have to try to bail myself out of that later. So if you get this one right the first time, it will not be a problem. Here you can see my final thing. As you can see, it's way too light. So I go over it with the black wash, just like everything else, although my plan was to do that anyway because I wanted to add a little bit of depth. Nice heavy black wash on this, because it does need to get that tone down. Again, if you put it on lighter, the black wash can be nice and light. Alright, so you can see that I base coated the bricks the same color as the other bricks, and I'm then going to go over them with the same black wash. This is going to be a very similar thing to painting the rest of the house. It's just much more chaotic. You're going to want to use the same colors and a lot of the same techniques, but you just got to be able to use them pretty sparingly and with some control to make sure that you don't really screw anything up. So the black wash will look really nice on this. I'm then going to go in with a few other brick colors afterwards. Make sure that there is color variation in the rubble. I don't paint a lot of rubble, so this is a bit of a shot in the dark, and this rubble's not very well made. Looking back on it, could have done a much better job with the brick clumps. I just felt like I didn't have time. But yeah, I'd say overall this is looking pretty good. As you can see, I gave it some of those highlights with the other brick colors, as well as some dusty looking colors before I went in and painted the wood the same color as everything else would. You can also see that I painted the floor up there the same way, and I highlighted the ends of the broken logs with some lighter wood colors. I then went in, painted each of the roof tiles the exact same way that I did last time. Like I said, this is basically just a rinse and repeat, but with a little bit more variation. One of the new techniques I used here was in pigments that I ground into it to replicate dust from the wall plaster exploding, and to give it some more color variations. I also took some pigments and put them on the road because I thought it might look a little bit nicer. Various colors. I used some white, I used some brown, I even used a little bit of green sprinkled in there, although be very sparing with the green. It will look very strange if you are not. Here you can see a bit of that road after pigmentation. That is still a little bit heavy and does need to get toned down. I keep going too heavy on things on the road. I don't know exactly why. And here you can see me positioning the house onto the road. This gives you a decent idea on the final diorama layout, as well as the condition of the house. Alright, so there we are. It's looking pretty good, although those edges on the house are going to need to be smoothed off a little bit. Alright, Time for some of the final weathering on the house. After gluing it down, I'm going to take a toothpick with some oil paint on it, and I'm going to poke and streak. Most of the streaking will be done with a brush afterwards, but it's good to get little lines done right now with the toothpick. Makes the streaking significantly easier. Now you can see me going in with the brush and streaking them. This, if done correctly, brush dipped in thinner gives a very, very nice subtle fading effect. But you got to make sure that you take most of the paint off the building, otherwise it looks very, very strange. I unfortunately have learned that from experience several times. Here you can see some of that streaking taking place. You got to be very, very careful with the streaking and ensure that it doesn't actually build up fully at the bottom, which it tends to do if you use too much thinner. But yeah, I'd say it looks pretty good. Now I'm putting PVA on the road, add a little bit of rubble out there, spread it around with the brush, you know the deal. Some of the rubble did spill outside the building, and although I probably should have put a little bit more than I ended up putting, I did go back out a little bit more later, and I'd say I'm pretty happy with it. I didn't want a lot in the road because I thought that it might mess with the tank a little bit, which you'll see the final layout near the end of the video. Here in this shot, you can also see that I've added a curb made out of cut sprues and some small garden next to the house. Here I am sprinkling the rubble on. The small garden next to the house was created just by filling in the area between the curb and the edge of the plastic sheet with the wall filler, and then pressing some of the roof tiles in to create stones for a walkway. Like I said, I put a little bit too little here. I am going to add some more later. And I am very sorry for the poor quality of the footage here. A lot of footage just kind of disappeared. I'm not sure where it went, and I'd like to have a lot more, but you know, sometimes you get a bit of a curveball and you just got to do your best with it. Alright, now for the end of the rubble, here you can see it. You got to blow the excess away, and then I'm going to press little bits of wood in because that seemed worth it. Again, I did it on the inside of the house, felt like there might be a little bit outside. Here you can see that I did add a little bit more, and I'm now painting it the same way that I painted the rubble on the inside, brick color, and then black wash, highlights, same deal there, pigments, and then painted the wood. Alright, that'll be about it for the house and the rubble, and it is time to move on to the garden. Like I said, this is just some spackle wall filler. And for the dirt mix, I took some PVA, some water, some paint, and some dirt, and I mixed it all together into this glorious concoction. The paint I use more as an indicator than anything. I'm going to end up repainting this. You don't have to use the paint. I just like it because it gives it a solid coat and just ensures that I've got everything covered. I'm leaving the area that the wall is going to be a little bit less covered so that it has a smooth surface to lie on, and I'm doing a much thinner coverage over the stones, and I'm then taking the paint off the stones with a swab. Alright, here you can see it all dried, and me adding some PVA to add grass to the garden. I'm not going to do anything fancy with the garden because, again, I kind of just didn't have the energy to do it. Probably should have added some flowers or something, but I wasn't sure how to do it in the scale, and I'm not gonna lie, just thought that grass would be completely fine. So I took some of the PVA, I spread it around with my brush into pretty amorphous blobs covering the majority of the area, although I am going to leave some of the ground poking through. But yeah, make sure that it covers most of it. I am going to use other lengths of static grass that you can see me dropping here later. The color does not matter because it will be painted later as well. I've just recently started painting my static grass. It looks significantly nicer than if you don't do so. Here you can see it all covered, and yeah, it'll cover most of the garden that isn't covered by the wall. I also added a couple clumps in there on the walkway to simulate weeds growing through. Now I'm going to add some more PVA to use for some more static grass. This is just some different static grass that I have, and I figured that getting a little bit of variety certainly would not hurt. It's the same deal, although I didn't use as much of this second variety. It's straw colored and longer than the other one. I don't really have a static grass applicator, which is why I'm doing it with my fingers and a tweezer. I need to get me one, I know, but I found that this can work pretty well as a stand-in. So now on to fixing that road that I was talking about. I'm going to be taking a brush. I'm going to be painting some of these bricks different color grays and browns, just like I did with the bricks on the wall and in the house. Now, there's a lot more here, although I'm using the same number of colors approximately. But I have to use a lot more of each color. I've also found that on this road, mistakes are a little bit easier to cover up. For example, that big orange patch in the middle is where some paint chipped off when I was going in way too heavy with the first coat. And it's going to be under the tank, so I just didn't fix it. It's a little bit lazy of me, but it won't have an effect on the final diorama. So I don't really feel that bad about it. Alright, now we're on to painting the ground. The first thing I'm going to do is prime everything black, give it a nice even starting point. Everything else here was primed with a light gray, but I decided to switch to black for this because earlier I was out of black primer, and I actually just prefer black primer generally. But yeah, I'm just going to go over, give the whole thing a solid coat of black before I go in, and I spray all of the grass with a dark green. You can have overspill on this, it is fine. Again, I try to keep it more centralized, but I don't really even know why. You could do the whole thing green and it wouldn't quite matter yet. You're going to go back over and paint the dirt again later. But now I'm going to go in with a lighter green, and I'm going to spray a highlight layer onto the dark green, really make it pop, because the dark green does not have much contrast with the dark brown. Speaking of the dark brown, I'm now going to go in. This should not have overspray. I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint all of the ground with a dark or medium brown. You can use whatever kind of soil you want for this, but I chose this darkish, medium-ish brown. I don't go try to make sure that I do not get this on the grass. Again, not the end of the world if you do, but it's preferable if you want some nicer lines on your diorama to make sure that it does not get on the grass. Alright, there you are. It looks pretty good. The last step is to glue down the wall and the tank, and then you are done. Overall, I'm actually pretty happy with this diorama, at least the individual parts technically. I do think it could have been a lot better executed by way of planning. This was definitely a learning experience for me. Next time I'm going to make sure the diorama looks a lot more dynamic and make sure that all the pieces fit much better together. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.